Former United States national security officials have reportedly held secret talks with Russians close to Vladimir Putin with the goal of laying the foundation for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, per 12 people briefed on the discussions, NBC News reports. Russian Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov reportedly met with the officials in New York in April of this year. Former American diplomat and departing president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, was one of the people who met with Lavrov. They were also joined by Europe expert Charles Kupchan and Russian expert Thomas Graham, both of whom are former White House and State Department officials who are also on Council of Foreign Relations fellows, NBC reports.
They allegedly discussed the future of Russian-held territory in Ukraine and an agreement that could, quote, could be tolerable to both Russia and Ukraine. Joining us now to discuss is senior fellow and military expert at Defense Priorities, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Thank you so much for joining us, Colonel. What do you make of the fact that this is former officials involved in these talks and not current officials, meaning, you know, aides at the White House or individuals with the State Department?
Yeah, it by itself, it's not necessarily unusual for these kinds of things. It's called track two diplomacy, which they typically want to have a layer of separation between the official government and the other party, so that they'll be a little bit more free to have conversations and just kind of musing about, well, what if, how about this, as opposed to any kind of official kind of situation, especially those that have to be made public. So by itself, it's fine. And actually, I encourage and have been on your show many times. That's exactly what we should be doing, is to try to find a way, both with Ukraine and with Russia, to see if we can find a way to end this war. But this one is a little bit more shrouded in uncertainty, because you have various people talking about that, yes, this has happened and we had these conversations. And then various times you actually have Lavrov saying, hey, I'll talk to anybody. But then in other reports that he flatly contradicted and said, no, I didn't have any conversation with these guys, and then ridiculed some of them as being relics from the 90s that he wouldn't have any serious discussions with. So it's really uncertain what's actually happening and with whom at this point.
What do you make of the individuals that were involved in these negotiations with Lavrov? Do you think that they're the relevant people to be negotiating on behalf of the United States to end the war in Ukraine? Or do you kind of see them as not at all representatives of the State Department and just independent actors?
I mean, by definition, they are, independent actors and private citizens all acting on their own behalf for the most part. But I certainly would have preferred to see somebody a little bit different, because a lot of these guys, frankly, have been kind of in something close to the neocon camp for quite a long time. And I'm not sure that they're the right people, the right mentality of people, the right temperament, if you will, to actually talk about ways that we can find a mutually agreeable path to end the war, because I think too mmany people in the United States, and these guys might seem to be sort of in that camp, are still looking at it from wanting to negotiate from a position of strength and a position of power, in that we want to try to dictate terms. We want to say, hey, we want you to make a deal, but terms that we like and terms that are agreeable to us. And right now, the Russians don't strike me as being in a mood to settle for anything that's to our advantage or to Ukraine's advantage. And so it remains to be seen what they'll do. And I think a lot of that's going to depend on what happens with the remainder of this offensive that's going on right now from Ukraine, and what the Russians do in response to the rest of the summer. So right now, I think it's probably a good idea. Well, actually, I know it's a good idea for anybody to be talking about peace, but I don't think anyone on any side is going to take anything seriously until after we see how things play out through the summer, unfortunately.
These conversations reportedly took place back in April. If they were to go back to the table at this point, do you think things would be a little bit different, considering the recent attempted coup by the Wagner Group? Do you think that the U.S. is coming from a little bit more of a position of strength at this point?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. I think it's the opposite, because that was April was before the Ukraine had launched their offensive. Now they have, and it's been so far a complete disaster from the perspective of the Ukraine side. They spearheaded this thing with two of their most well-trained, well-equipped, NATO-trained, and I'm talking about with U.S. Bradley fighting vehicles, German tanks, and they were just ran into a buzzsaw. They just haven't made any penetrations to date. Meanwhile, this whole issue with the Prigozhin, it was certainly an embarrassment for Putin. It was something that it didn't want to happen, but it has actually very little impact on the fighting because Wagner had already been taken off the line after they took Bakhmut at the end of May. So they weren't even really part of any of the defense right now. They were being rebuilt for potential use in the future. And who knows, maybe they still will, or at least some of them. But it really has had no operational impact. And you got to consider that was maybe 25,000 out of somewhere around 380,000 troops that Russia has in Ukraine at the moment. So percentage-wise, it wasn't that big of a deal. It remains to be seen what that will do to Russia's offensive capacity, because the Wagner Group was their most effective offensive unit, and that remains to be seen what they can do later. But it hasn't done anything. It hasn't had any impact, pro or con, on Russia's defense ability, which they have really, really done well by any measure, unfortunately, for the Ukraine side.
So given that this is former U.S. officials, right, it's track 2 diplomacy, or maybe track 1.5, given that Sergei Lavrov is an active member of the Russian government. He's a current official. But there's no one representing the Ukrainians in these negotiations. And President Zelensky has said, we can't decide the fate of Ukraine without Ukraine. But just being real, is that true? Can we decide the fate of the war without Ukraine at the table?
Right. Yeah, we were very public and adamant many times about saying nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. But as you point out very well, the reality has always been very different. Ukraine has had their desires, and it's self-evident that they've asked for things and demanded things that they didn't get until, for whatever reasons, we finally decided to go ahead and give it to them. But the reality is that without the United States support primarily, the West in general, but the U.S. in particular, this war doesn't continue on. And without our active support, the war can come to an end. Therefore, with our active encouragement in the diplomatic area, it can come to pass. We do have that kind of leverage, and that's just the reality of it. And so if we have to worry about taking advantage importance of American national security interest and American economic interest and our allies in NATO and in the European Union, that's something that we have to look out for first. We can't just say, hey, it's just a blank check and anything that you guys want, as long as it takes, we'll just do it. Even if it's not in our national interest, I think those days are starting to come to an end. And with this now full month of a failure to really show on the battlefield that Ukraine can win this with all of the stuff we've given them for the past 16 months, I think is causing some people to reevaluate whether we need to push more on the diplomatic track.
To your point about the individuals who are involved in these talks maybe falling more in the neocon camp, they did end up writing an article for Foreign Affairs around the time that these meetings supposedly took place, talking about the path forward to negotiations. And they said, before we can get Russia to the negotiating table, we have to bolster Ukraine's defenses. We're not quite at the point yet where we would be able to reach a settlement. So does that give you even more pause potentially about the way that they're approaching these talks and the likelihood of their success?
Well, yeah, and you've seen in recent days, even with some other revelations, that some American officials and apparently some Ukrainian officials had an objective in some of these this offensive to be able to push all the way down to Crimea, to cut off the land bridge, to put Crimea under the threat of long-range and midterm missiles, and then from a position of power to negotiate an end. Look, that was never realistic. And anybody that thought that doesn't really understand the dynamics involved, the history involved, and the combat power ratios that are involved. Because as you now see very graphically, the Ukraine side is not going to be able to even get close to reaching that objective to be able to put Crimea at threat. So if you're hoping that you can, from a position of power, get terms that are to your advantage, now then you're seeing that instead you've shown yourself as more vulnerable, which means now that if negotiations do take place, Ukraine is going to get a less good deal than they would have otherwise if they had tried something, for example, before this offensive. So my view is the longer we wait on this, the worse kind of a deal Ukraine is ultimately going to get.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for helping us break this down.
Always my pleasure. Thanks for having me.